Welcome to the Fantasy Source Football Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with Bill Bender. We're looking forward at a week with bid running back buys. Chris Johnson's going to be out. A few other bid names. Frank Gore for another one. But this week, wide receivers are in the spotlight, especially and starting with Randy Moss.
Well, it's just a strange moment when you heard he was waived the other day, then released. We were like, what? He plays only 4 weeks with the Vikings, and then again when the Titans pick him up, people were like, what? Jeff Fisher? Why?
Yeah, I mean, not only did the Titans pick him up, and I'm totally along with the people who think Jeff Fisher has the kind of gravitas that can actually get through to Randy Moss, because he can get through to anybody. But I would say that I am shocked that the Chargers didn't try to pick him up, or several other teams, Chargers especially, who are ahead of the Titans in waiver priority and still have an outside chance of making the playoffs this year. I mean, that's the most important thing as far as if you're in that state where you're 3-5 or something like that. You want to make the playoffs, you still got an outside chance at it, get the best player available. It's doubly shocking that Sean Merriman, a guy who's pretty much a husk of his former self, got picked up, and Randy Moss is still getting double-teamed every single game he plays. One team tried to claim him.
Well, I think it's a good move for the Tennessee Titans, just because they lost Kenny Britt in the hamstring injury. He's going to miss, 6 to 8 weeks. So owners probably can plan on being without him for the rest of the season. As for Randy Moss, Kenny Britt caught 7 touchdowns and averaged 18.9 yards per reception in that offense. With Chris Johnson, it's going to open up more lanes. With Randy Moss, he's going to take up coverage, and he'll find ways to get open. And Vince Young, believe it or not, leads the league in quarterback ratings. So you put all of that together, give it a bye week, and you look at their schedule. They got Houston twice and Indianapolis twice. Randy Moss, provided Jeff Fisher keeps his head on straight, then I think he's a good wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 play for the rest of the season, but maybe not a dominant wide receiver 1.
So in other words, if you already had him, don't panic, don't drop him, sit through the bye, wait for him to come back, you're good.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, it does we're counting on Randy Moss being on good behavior, which you can never really count on. But, give Jeff Fisher a chance. Give him a chance with Chris Johnson, Vince Young. That's a good team, and they're always centered. They always seem to have good discipline and whatnot, and they're going to make a run at the playoffs, and they need Randy Moss to play well, so give it a chance.
Other wide receivers that want to address this week, guys coming back from various absences, a couple of them from injury. Vincent Jackson, coming back from holdout and suspension. He's going to be set to return in week 12, which, if you're paying close attention in fantasy football world, is right before most fantasy football playoff seasons begin. How do you see him performing when he does come back?
Well, we get a lot of questions about Jackson on a weekly basis. Should I drop him? Should I hold on to him? And I always say, if you've held on to him into week 8 or week 9, why would you drop him now? So I think owners need to hold on to him through week 12, see what happens. I do like his matchups in the fantasy playoffs, and you can kind of look ahead. The Niners and Chiefs, 22nd and 23rd in pass defense, so that's good. And then he'll face the Bengals in week 16. He had 108 yards and 2 touchdowns when he played against the Bengals last year. So that's planting the seed a little early, and you obviously have to get through the playoffs to get there. But I think Vincent Jackson's a nice little X factor to have off the bench coming forward.
Moving to one of Randy Moss's old teams, I guess 2 times now his old team, the Minnesota Vikings, Sidney Rice. I mean, if you've forgotten about him already, you probably shouldn't have forgotten about him.
Right, but I don't like Sidney Rice as much as I like Vincent Jackson.
Yeah, even before Vincent Jackson was a better wide receiver when they played.
Right, and Sidney Rice is coming off the hip surgery and the hip issues. Not to mention that Brett Favre's in, he's out. We don't know what's going on. Sidney Rice, at least you'll have him earlier. I think he's going to come back that week they play the Packers in what will basically be a do-or-die game for their season. So you got to watch him that week, see how he's moving, maybe give him 1 or 2 weeks before trying him in the lineup.
So in the fantasy playoffs, it looks like he's got a pretty tough matchup, starting with the Jets, right?
Yeah, they got the Jets, Bears, and Eagles through weeks 14 and 16, and by then, again, Darrelle Revis probably going to be completely healthy. We don't know what kind of shape the Vikings are going to be in record-wise, mentality-wise, so I think Sidney Rice, he's just kind of, maybe he hits, but I have my doubts. Whereas Vincent Jackson, most of that's attitude-related, and the Chargers will find a way to weasel their way back into that AFC West race like they always do.
You mentioned the Eagles. DeSean Jackson is going to be making his return. He had, that was one of the scariest hits I've seen in a long time. Helmet to helmet, just prone, completely knocked out. we obviously have limited information, and teams are going to be very careful about what they say about those guys. But from what we've been able to gather, how do you see Jackson performing, DeSean Jackson performing in this week and then moving forward?
Well, obviously, with the concussion, and like you said, it was nasty, you got to temper your expectations for him this week. I would personally play him based on the matchup. They're playing an awful Redskins pass defense. He's got Michael Vick back. Michael Vick's going to test his arm early, try to get it down the field. So we'll find out real quick how healthy DeSean Jackson is. So I would play him, but I would maybe expect wide receiver 3 production. Don't expect an elite 200-yard, 2-touchdown game because you'll be disappointed.
So would you say that you'd actually, knowing what we know, you'd actually put other factors, weight them heavier rather than he's coming back from a concussion? It's like Vic is much more important. Vic or Kolb is much more important to his performance.
Well, if they're on the field, I've always said that if they're on the field, they're ready to go. He's not going to come back from a head injury with all the talk that's been in the league. If he's not okay, he's not going to play.
Any other guys that you see, wide receivers, that you think are worth mentioning as potential sleeper candidates? Maybe they're sitting on your bench and you ought to give a longer look at them at starting?
I like 3 guys this weekend that you might not normally start. I like Darius Hayward-Bay.
By the way, that may be a fantasy first.
Yes, it is. But he's getting the targets with Lewis Murphy and Zach Miller banged up. And that's a big game between the Raiders and Chiefs, believe it or not. So I think he's a decent boomer-bust wide receiver 3. I like Jordy Nelson for the Packers against that awful Dallas pass defense. And Donald Driver's a little banged up, and James Jones has been inconsistent. So Jordy Nelson may be the consistent guy that finally gets in the end zone. And I like Braylon Edwards going home to Detroit. He's a Detroit guy, and there's a bit of homerism in that pick, but I think he scores in the Lions. His focus, sometimes there, sometimes isn't there. I think it's there when he's home because he's going to want to perform well.
All right, Bill, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.